Hey everybody, Mr. Bruss back here, and I just wanted to finish up the conversation we were having, or the description we were having, of radiocarbon dating. How do we know how old an artifact or old bones are? Based on the amount of carbon of different types they have, carbon-14 versus carbon-12. So I'm going to share back to this slideshow, and then we're going to spend most of our time using the lecture guide and kind of going through here. So as I was finishing up the last video, I was mentioning that that in any organism, there's a combination of carbon-12 and carbon-14. And we know the difference between those two is just the number of neutrons that are in the nucleus of the carbon atom. So a carbon atom is defined by the number of protons it has. All of carbon atoms have 6. But while carbon-12 has 6 neutrons, carbon-14 has 8 neutrons. And that carbon-14 is not stable. It goes through what's called radioactive decay, and it decays back into nitrogen. So it's gone. If you're looking to measure it over time, it disappears. And the rate at which it disappears is half of it disappears every 5,730 years. So if you talked about this in money, if you had $100, 5,730 years later, you would only have $50. And 5,730 years after that, you would only have $25. And 5,730 years after that, you would only have $12.50, and so on. So we call that age the half-life of carbon. And that's shown right here, where every 5,730 years, we lose half of the carbon-14 that was there. So it goes from 100 to 50. And then another 5,730 years later, we go from 50% of the original amount of carbon-14 down to 25%. And there's really specialized instruments that can measure this amount of carbon-14 and compare it to the amount of carbon-12. So what I'd like to do is I want to just go through this in the lecture guide. So I'm going to share my iPad here and kind of talk through just the last few points of this on that evolution lecture guide. So here we are, page 3, we had finished up kind of comparing carbon-12 to carbon-14. And now we're kind of going to dive into being able to answer some questions about this. So do you have carbon-14 in your body right now? Yes. If so, how much? Well, we could figure out the exact amount of carbon-14 as compared to the amount of carbon-12, but I'm going to say less than 1% of all carbon is carbon-14. Okay, maybe I'll switch this to black here. What happens to carbon-14 in an animal after it dies? It disappears by radioactive decay. And if you want to be more specific, it gets converted into nitrogen, and some energy is lost as well. So what percentage of the original carbon-14 will remain 22,920 years after an organism dies? So this stretch right here is 5,730 years. This stretch right here is 5,730 years. This stretch right here is 5,730 years. And the stretch to 22,920 is another 5,730 years. So this goes from 100 to 50% to 25% to 12.5%. And this is now going to go to something like 6.25% of the original will be remaining. So this would be 6.25%. What happens to carbon-12 in an animal after it dies? Well, it stays there. I mean, some of this, in reality, I think the easiest way to think about it is it just stays there. If you're ready to think about this a little bit more deeply, in fact, what happens to animals and organisms after they die is they get decomposed. But the carbon-12, the percent of carbon-12 of the entire animal will stay the same while the carbon-14 leaves. So it's really that ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 that changes. But if you want to simplify, it just stays there. It doesn't change. And we're gonna use that simplified version. So let's fill in the blanks to illustrate what happens to carbon-14 and carbon-12 after it dies. So let's start with the carbon-12. So this is a giraffe that died in 2019, and we're going to be measuring it way out into the future. So the carbon-12, we're going to say, doesn't change at all. And now, again, that's a little bit of an oversimplification, but let's just, for our purposes, that's fine. Carbon-12 stays there. And every 5,730 years, we lose half of the original carbon-14. So we go from 100 to 50, from 50 to 25, and from 25 to 12.5%. And this ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 can be used then to determine how long ago something died. And if we're looking at old paper or cloth, that came from a plant at some point in time. And so usually that paper was produced pretty soon after the tree was cut down and the paper was made. And we can actually measure the age of certain documents, historical documents, in addition to bones of animals, of fossils that have died. So the way to really look at this is to look at a graph here. And what we're looking at here is the remaining carbon-14 versus time after the organism has died. So we start here with 100% of the original carbon-14. And after 5,730 years, there is only 50%, half the amount of carbon remaining. And if we go here now to, represents 11,460, there's only 25% of the original remaining. So my question for you is approximately how much of the original carbon-14 is remaining after 20,000 years? So what I do is I go on the x-axis here to 20,000 years, and I see this point here. And then I draw this line across, try to make it straight. And, that looks to me like there's approximately 9%. I wouldn't get mad if you said 10% there. Probably about 9% of the original carbon-14 remaining. So what scientists would do is they would measure the atmosphere. Currently, what's the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 in the atmosphere? And then they compare that to a sample. And if the sample only has 9% of that original carbon-14 remaining, then the scientist is going to say, oh, this sample is approximately 20,000 years old. It died 20,000 years ago. So here's another way to ask this. How old is an artifact with 30% of its original carbon-14 remaining? So you're a scientist, you grab a little sample of maybe a really old what looks like a jacket or a cape, a shroud, something that would cover someone, and you take a little sample of that. You put it in your instrument, and the reading comes back that there's 30% of the expected carbon-14 is there. So then you would go to your graph here. On the y-axis, you would find 30% remaining. You take that, you draw it over, you draw the line over to the curve, and then you draw the line down. And it looks to me, this is the line for 10,000. And I didn't draw that perfectly, but you would say that this item, the fossil shroud, something that would cover someone, is approximately 10,000 years old. Now I'm asking you here to explain one way that scientists have confirmed the accuracy of radiocarbon dating. So I want to go back to our lecture here, and I want to show you something. So while I'm doing that, you could think, how could you confirm this, right? So some scientists came up with this and says, carbon-14 decays at this rate. We've measured it. We've measured it in the lab. We can determine by how much energy is lost, how much nitrogen is created. But again, they're not conducting these experiments for 5,000 years. They're doing them over a few months or a year at the most. And they're saying that this works for things that are very old. So before they can publish that, before the scientific community will accept that as an answer, they're going to need more proof. Scientists are a fickle bunch, and we need proof. We need you to confirm that your measurements are right. And I'm asking you while I'm pulling up this thing, how would you do that? How would you confirm the accuracy of this? And so here we are. Went through our graph here, and here is how you would do that. And this is really creative, and it speaks to how scientists operate. So there's a number of items, these Ptolemaic coffins, this known piece of wood, this funeral boat. These are artifacts that the age of which is well established by historical documents. And in fact, historians are scientists in a sense too, and they don't accept just one document. So there's multiple documents, multiple oral traditions, multiple paintings, things that all converge so that we know the age historically of these items. And what you can then do is take a small sample of these, measure them, and then see, does it match up? Does the carbon-14 predict the same thing as we know the age to be? And it turns out it does. It works perfectly. So they've done this for a number of historic artifacts. And now, if you bring this back to what we were talking about with the tree rings. So remember, there's these forests where trees have died in the White Mountains of California, but they preserve the rings, but the climate is so dry that these old dead trees, long dead trees, 7,000-year-old trees haven't decomposed. So you can take samples of those. And remember, we know the age of those from dating them back, from all the matching up the signatures of the rings. So we know how old that tree is. And the carbon-14 matches that as well. And they've done this with an old stump that historically we know when that tree was cut down. You can determine how old it is. And this is just one example of one such study. I just don't want you to think I was making this stuff up. So this is what's called a calibration curve. So this was done in 1975. So this has been known for a long time, where you can take historical known aged artifacts and compare it to what you would expect to see from carbon-14, and they match up exactly. So what that says is that, like I was saying before, in addition to those artifacts, the carbon-14 confirms what we would expect to see from these trees. So now we've taken counting rings of trees, right? So everyone can agree that yes, one ring equals 1 year. Then you can notice the signature in the rings of trees, and you can match those up and date them back about 10,000 years. Then comes in this new tool of measuring the decay of carbon-14, and it seems to match exactly with what we would expect for the trees, as well as old artifacts. So it seems that this newer approach also works to, and is confirmed to work to measure the age of things that have died. And this new technique now extends us out to 50,000 years, maybe even 100,000 years. So based on starting from counting rings and a method that matches and confirms this, the matching the ring, we now know the age of the Earth is at least 50 to 100,000 years old. So what does this tell us? So carbon-14 is in all living things. It decays at a very well-established rate after a living organism dies. Measuring the amount of carbon-14 in remains of once living things tells us how long ago it died. This technique is called radiocarbon dating and can accurately determine the age to approximately 100,000 years old. And this radiocarbon dating has been confirmed with historical artifacts and trees, and it is very well-established technique, and its accuracy is accepted by all scientists. So next lecture, we're going to move on and see if we can extend radiocarbon dating and this method of radioactive decay of an element and actually find the age of things that are even much, much older than 100,000 years. So thanks for listening, and I will see you next time.